Aldous Huxley's Island, Part 10. But the Sultan had reckoned without the Professor's wife. Madame Bouleuse was only 40, plump, sentimental, bubblingly enthusiastic and, though officially of her husband's Protestant persuasion, a newly converted and intensely ardent theosophist. In a room at the top of the tall house near the Place de la Ripon she had her oratory, to which, whenever she could find time, she would secretly retire to do breathing exercises, practice concentration, and raise kundalini. Strenuous disciplines, but the reward was transcendently great. In the small hours of a hot summer night, while the darling old professor lay rhythmically snoring 2 floors down, she had become aware of a presence. The master Kuthumi was with her. The Rani made an impressive pause. "Extraordinary," said Mr. Baboon. "Extraordinary," Will dutifully echoed. The Rani resumed her narrative. Irrepressibly happy, Madame Bouleuse had been unable to keep her secret. She had dropped mysterious hints, had passed from hints to confidences, from confidences to an invitation to the oratory, and of course instruction. A course of instruction. In a very short time, Kuthumi was bestowing greater favours upon the novice than upon the teacher. And from that day to this, she concluded, the master has helped me to go forward. To go forward, Will asked himself, into what? Kuthumi only knew. But whatever it was that she had gone forward into, he didn't like it. There was an expression on that large florid face which he found particularly distasteful, an expression of domineering calm, of serene and unshakable self-esteem. She reminded him in a curious way of Joe Aldehyde. Joe was one of those happy tycoons who feels no qualms, but rejoice without inhibition in their money and in all that their money will buy in the way of influence and power. And here, albeit clothed in white samite, mystical, wonderful, was another of Joe Aldehyde's breed, a female tycoon who had cornered the market, not in soybeans or copper, but in pure spirituality and the ascended masters, and now was happily running her hands over the exploit. "Here's one example of what he's done for me," the Rani went on. 8 years ago, to be exact, on the 23rd of November 1953, the master came to me in my morning meditation, came in person, came in glory. "A great crusade is to be launched," he said, "a world movement to save humanity from self-destruction. And you, my child, are the appointed instrument." "Me? A world movement? But that's absurd," I said. "I've never made a speech in my whole life. I've never written a word for publication. I've never been a leader or an organizer." "Nevertheless," he said, and he gave me one of those indescribably beautiful smiles of his, "nevertheless, it is you who will launch this crusade, the worldwide crusade of the spirit. You'll be laughed at, you'll be called a fool, a crank, a fanatic. The dogs bark, the caravan passes. From tiny laughable beginnings, the crusade of the spirit is destined to become a mighty force, a force for good, a force that will ultimately save the world." And with that he left me stunned, bewildered, scared out of my wits, but there was nothing for it. I had to obey. I did obey. And what happened? I made speeches, and he gave me eloquence. I accepted the burden of leadership, and, because he was walking invisibly at my side, people followed me. I asked for help, and the money came pouring in. So here I am. She threw out her thick hands in a gesture of self-depreciation. She smiled a mystic smile. "A poor thing," she seemed to be saying, "but not my own. My master's, Kuthumi's." "Here I am," she repeated. "Here, praise God," said Mr. Bahu devoutly, "you are." After a decent interval, Will asked the Rani if she had always kept up the practices so providentially learned in Madame Bouleuse's oratory. "Always," she answered. "I could no more do without meditation than I could do without food." "Wasn't it rather difficult after you were married? I mean, before you went back to Switzerland? There must have been so many tiresome official duties." Not to mention all the unofficial ones, said the Rani, in a tone that implied whole volumes of unfavourable comment upon her late husband's character, Weltanschauung, and sexual habits. She opened her mouth to elaborate on the theme, then closed it again and looked at Murugan. "Darling," she called. Murugan, who was absorbedly polishing the nails of his left hand upon the palm of his right, looked up with a guilty start. "Yes, mother?" Ignoring the nails and his evident inattention to what she had been saying, the Rani gave him a seducing smile. "Be an angel," she said, "and go and fetch the car. My little voice doesn't say anything about walking back to the bungalow. It's only a few 100 yards," she explained to Will, "but in this heat and at my age." Her words called for some kind of flattering rebuttal, but if it was too hot to walk, it was also too hot, Will felt, to put forth the very considerable amount of energy required for a convincing show of bogus sincerity. Fortunately, a professional diplomat, a practised courtier, was on hand to make up for the uncouth journalist's deficiencies. Mr. Bahu uttered a peal of light-hearted laughter, then apologised for his merriment. "But it was really too funny. At my age," he repeated, and laughed again. "Murugan is not quite 18, and I happen to know how very young, the Princess of Rendang was when she married the Rajah of Pala." Murugan, meanwhile, had obediently risen and was kissing his mother's hand. "Now we can talk more freely," said the Rani, when he had left the room. And freely, her face, her tone, her bulging eyes, her whole quivering frame registering the most intense disapproval, she now let fly. De mortuis. She wouldn't say anything about her husband except that, in most respects, he was a typical Palanese, a true representative of his country. For the sad truth was that Parla's smooth, bright skin concealed the most horrible rottenness. "When I think what they tried to do to my baby 2 years ago, when I was on my world tour through the crusade of the spirit," with a jingling of bracelets she lifted her hands in horror. "It was an agony for me to be parted from him for so long, but the master had sent me on a mission, and my little voice told me that it wouldn't be right for me to take my baby with me. He'd lived abroad for so long, it was time for him to get to know the country he was to rule, so I decided to leave him here. The Privy Council appointed a committee of guardianship, 2 women with growing boys of their own and 2 men, one of whom, I regret to say, more in sorrow than anger, was Dr. Robert MacPhail. Well, to cut a long story short, no sooner was I safely out of the country than those precious guardians to whom I'd entrusted my baby, my only son, set to work systematically, Mr. Farnaby, to undermine my influence. They tried to destroy the whole edifice of moral and spiritual values which I had so laboriously built up over the years." Somewhat maliciously, for of course he knew what the woman was talking about, Will expressed his astonishment. The whole edifice of moral and spiritual values? And yet nobody could have been kinder than Dr. Robert and the others. No good Samaritans were ever more simply and effectively charitable. "I am not denying their kindness," said the Rani, "but after all, kindness isn't the only virtue." "Of course not," Will agreed, and he listed all the qualities that the Rani seemed most conspicuously to lack. "There's also sincerity, not to mention truthfulness, humility, selflessness." You're forgetting purity," said the Rani severely. "Purity is fundamental. Purity is the sine qua non." "But here in Parlour, I gather, they don't think so." "They most certainly do not," said the Rani, and she went on to tell him how her poor baby had been deliberately exposed to impurity, even actively encouraged to indulge in it with one of those precocious, promiscuous girls of whom, in Parlour, there were only too many. And when they found that he wasn't the sort of boy who would seduce a girl, for she had brought him up to think of woman as essentially holy, they had encouraged the girl to do her best to seduce him. Had she, Will wondered, succeeded? Or had Antinous already been girl-proofed by little friends of his own age, or, still more effectively, by some older, more experienced and authoritative pederast, some Swiss precursor of Colonel Dipper? But that wasn't the worst. The Rani lowered her voice to a horrified stage whisper. One of the mothers on the committee of guardianship, one of the mothers, mind you, advised him to take a course of lessons. What sort of lessons? In what they euphemistically call love. She wrinkled up her nose as though she had smelt raw sewage. Lessons, if you please. And disgust now turned into indignation. Lessons from some older woman. Heavens, cried the ambassador. Heavens, Will dutifully echoed. Those older women, he could see, were competitors much more dangerous in the Rani's eyes than even the most precociously promiscuous of girls. A mature instructress in love would be a rival mother, enjoying the monstrously unfair advantage of being free to go to the limits of incest. They teach, the Rani hesitated, they teach special techniques. What sort of techniques? Will inquired. But she couldn't bring herself to go into the repulsive particulars, and anyhow it wasn't necessary, for Murrigan, bless his heart, had refused to listen to them. Lessons in immorality from someone old enough to be his mother, the very idea of it had made him sick. No wonder. He had been brought up to reverence the ideal of purity, brahmacharya, if you know what that means. Quite, said Will.